Hey guys, so a lot's been happening the past few days, and I wanted to give my 2 cents on the situation. And if you hear noise in the background, just ignore it. It's pouring outside. But yeah, I want to talk about what happened this past week and also what has been happening around the world for the past 2 years. And so I wanted to provide a different perspective on what everyone's talking about, and the way I see it is that it's not tragedy that moves us in any way, shape, or form. It's whether the victim fits the story we want to tell. We live in a world where sympathy is not simply given, it's negotiated, and often it's weaponized. And it depends less on the fact of suffering itself and more on whether the person suffering fits the image, I guess I'll call the perfect victim. To be recognized as that kind of victim, it's not enough to simply be harmed. You have to look the part, you have to claim the part, and most importantly, others have to see you as useful to their narrative. And you see this all the time. The Ukrainian girl, Irina, who was stabbed in a train in America by an African-American man, when we saw that story, we noticed how certain parts of the internet were lit up, and it was that she was, in their mind, the perfect victim. She was young, white, innocent, and a casualty who neatly reinforced their broader story about crime and race in America. Overnight, her tragedy turned into a rallying event, and at the same time, you had others downplaying the event, denying that it could possibly be considered a hate crime, because admitting that would disrupt their personal framing and political narratives. And it's that the tragedy itself, the brutal reality that a young woman's life was cut short, got lost in the debate. She wasn't grieved for the fact that she was a human being, that her life was cut short, and for her humanity. She was debated for her symbolism. And if we compare this to Gaza, for nearly 2 years now, the world has seen footage of children being pulled out of the rubble, of families being wiped out in seconds, of communities being starved, bombarded, in what many humanitarian organizations call and openly described it as a genocide. Yet for millions, these victims were not the perfect victims. They didn't fit the right political, racial, or religious profile that elicit unconditional sympathy. They were rationalized away, their deaths were minimized, and even justified in the name of some kind of security. Instead of being mourned as human beings, they were framed as collateral damage, as somehow deserving of their fate because of the politics imposed on them. And that's exactly what I want to talk about. I want to talk about this aesthetic of victimhood, and it's about the way empathy has become conditional. Who deserves mourning, who deserves outrage, and who deserves silence isn't decided by the reality of what happened, but by politics, by race, and by religion or ideology. This isn't new, though. This has been reoccurring throughout history, how we've seen some tragedies that have been elevated as some universal human loss, while others were ignored or dismissed or even mocked in a very cruel way. The Holocaust, for example, is rightly remembered as one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. And yet, at the exact same time, colonial famines in Africa or India that killed millions of people were treated as unfortunate footnotes and not as global outrage. To be mourned, you have to be the right kind of victim in the right place at the right time, in the right body. But in our digital age, the dynamic feels even more brutal. Every tragedy becomes instantly reframed through the lens of content and commentary. Victims are transformed into symbols, and their humanity is flattened into narratives that serve whoever is spewing them. And it's not about what happened anymore. It's more about what their suffering can be made to represent. Have we lost our ability to see beyond the narrative, to condemn wrong regardless of who commits it, and to mourn loss without needing to validate our politics? If we can't do that, then every tragedy risks becoming another piece of ammunition in our ideological wars, rather than to affirm our dignity of human life. So, what do I mean by the perfect victim? It's not about the tragedy itself. It's about how that tragedy is received, interpreted, and circulated in society. The perfect victim is the one whose suffering reinforces the moral or political narrative that others already believe in. Their pain confirms a worldview, it legitimizes a stance, and it tells a story that people want to hear. That's why the Ukrainian girl's murder was amplified in the way that it was. Her death is not only shocking in itself, but it became a tool. To some, she symbolized innocence violated by the forces of crime, race, and lawlessness. She fit neatly into the pre-existing story about America that certain groups were ready to tell. And so she was mourned loudly as seen to be the perfect victim. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The tragedy of her life wasn't mourned equally across the board. For others, her story was inconvenient. Acknowledging it as a hate crime didn't align with their politics, so it had to be erased or denied and even downplayed. The perfect victim is in many ways a mirror. They reflect back to us our political biases, our racial hierarchies, and our ideological commitments. And in that kind of reflection, their actual humanity gets lost. They are not mourned as individuals, as complex people with families and stories of their own. They are mourned or ignored and even weaponized, depending on how well they fit the script. Take 9/11, for example. Nearly 3,000 people were killed on that single day, and it rightly was seen as a tragedy. But it also reshaped the American psyche. It drew global sympathy, and to this day is remembered as a world-altering event. The names of these victims are read yearly, and their faces are etched into monuments. Their loss has been universally seen and mourned. But what about the people who died as a result to the response to 9/11? According to the Cost of War Project at Brown University, the war on terror led to at least 900,000 direct deaths and displaced over 38 million people across countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, families, children died in drone strikes, bombings, and military interventions. But here is the real question. Where are their names? Where are their memorials? Why aren't their deaths treated with the same moral weight as those who had passed in the US? This double standard goes even further back. Consider the Holocaust. The industrialized mass killing of 6 million Jews in Europe stands out as one of the most horrific crimes of the 20th century, and rightly so. The world recognized it as a crime against humanity itself. It became the very definition of atrocity. But at the exact same time, while the world was reckoning with Nazi crimes, Britain's colonial policies in India led to the Bengal famine of 1943, where 3 million people were starved to death. Winston Churchill's cabinet continued to export food from India during this famine, with Churchill himself infamously blaming Indians for breeding like rabbits. Millions of lives were lost, but those lives never became central to our collective memory. They weren't seen as victims of global injustice. They were just forgotten. And think about the Herero and Namakwa genocide in Namibia at the hands of German colonizers in the early 1900s. Tens of thousands of indigenous Africans were exterminated through starvation, through concentration camps, and forced labor. Yet for decades, this genocide barely registered in Western memory. It didn't fit the narrative of who was was mournable and human. And that's the pattern. Victimhood is not distributed evenly. Some groups were given full weight of collective sympathy, while others were treated as footnotes or as collateral. Some lives were remembered as defining tragedies, while others were quietly erased. And the criteria for this distinction is not the scale of suffering, but the politics of recognition. This is what Judith Butler talks about in Frames of War. When is life grievable? Butler argues that not all lives are recognized as lives worth mourning. Some deaths are automatically treated as tragedies, others are invisible and unworthy of collective grief. It's not about the reality of suffering. It's about whether that suffering is intelligible within the framework of who we've already decided deserves sympathy. Butler writes, specific lives cannot be apprehended as injured or lost if they are not first apprehended as living. In other words, if someone isn't fully recognized as human in a political imagination, then their suffering will barely register. This doesn't just happen in extreme cases. Think about media coverage. Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman in Manufacturing Consent showed decades ago how Western media systematically values some victims over others. A bombing in Paris or any Western state dominates headlines for weeks, while bombings in Mogadishu or any other third world country will barely make the footnotes. And it's not that one is more tragic than the other. It's about one fitting a narrative of Western security and vulnerability, while the other happens in a place the audience has already been trained not to care about. But if we're being completely honest here, this hasn't gone away. It just looks kind of different now. The victims of 9/11 will forever be remembered, but the children killed by drone strikes in Pakistan or Yemen are unnamed or invisible. The Holocaust is rightly taught as a lesson in human evil, but colonial famines and genocides in other places are rarely given the same weight or recognition. We've always had this hierarchy of empathy, and it's always been political. And that's what makes our present moments so dangerous, because if empathy can be so unevenly distributed, if victimhood can be granted or denied based on narrative convenience, then it's no longer about affirming the dignity of human life. It's about power, and once sympathy becomes a tool for power, then it loses the very thing that makes it human. Because they don't fit in the category of the perfect victim, their suffering didn't reinforce America's story of innocence violated. Instead, they were cast as collateral damage, or worse, as the enemy. They were not framed as innocent lives, but as shadows in a distant war. Their humanity didn't fit the narrative, and so their grief never became universal grief. And this is where the aesthetic of victimhood comes in. To be seen as this true victim, it's not about the suffering, as I keep mentioning. It's not about the suffering. It's about the presentation and about the legibility of this suffering. Do you look like the kind of person others are willing to cry for? Did you come from the right country, practice the right religion, belong to the right race? If not, then sympathy is not for you. And here's the danger. Once the sympathy becomes conditional, it becomes political currency. Victimhood is no longer about the dignity of human life. It's about who can be used as score points to prove a case or to fuel outrage. Tragedy turns into spectacle, and empathy turns into a weapon. Gaza is the clearest, most heartbreaking example of this. For almost 2 years, the world has been flooded with images of children being pulled out of the rubble, of families digging looking for their other family members with their bare hands, hospitals collapsing from bombings, and just the intense humanitarian blockade. The United Nations and Human Rights Watch, and as well as Amnesty International, have all documented this as collective punishment, and many legal scholars now call this a genocide. And yet, for millions of people, these victims are not recognized as victims at all. Their suffering is explained away with phrases like human shield or terrorist sympathizer. Their humanity is denied because they happen to be Palestinian. Palestinian or that they happen to be Muslim, simply because their lives don't align with the political framework some of these people hold. Judith Butler wrote that we are asked to mourn selectively, to grieve according to the differential value of lives. And Gaza shows us what this means in real time. A child in Israel killed is universally mourned, but a child in Gaza killed by an airstrike is treated as a complication. That grief is conditional. And once grief becomes conditional, then even death is politicized. And this doesn't only happen in Gaza. Look at Africa. Millions of people in Sudan are facing a famine right now. Conflict in Congo has displaced over 7 million people in the largest displacement crisis in Africa. And there are many other massacres and forms of starvation, sexual violence used as weapons of war in other parts of the world. Yet, how often do you hear these stories dominate global headlines? How often are these victims treated as universally mournable? Too often, their suffering is written off as a tribal violence, internal conflict, or as something that just you don't need to worry about. The complexity of politics becomes an excuse not to feel. The narrative becomes, that's just how things are there. And so, as a result, sympathy and empathy are withheld. But when empathy becomes conditional, it's not really empathy though, is it? It becomes ideology dressed up as compassion. And it's what Noam Chomsky warned about, the way powerful nations and their media manufacture consent by teaching us whose pain counts and whose pain doesn't. And once you see that, it's impossible to unsee it. Even in the West, we play this game all the time. When we talk about the aesthetic of victimhood, one of the clearest examples we see are the way school shootings are being processed. Every time one happens, the cycle is the same. Outpourings of grief, and then almost immediately, there's debate. But what strikes me the most is how quickly the humanity of these victims, often children, is sidelined in favor of protecting a narrative. Take the response of someone like Charlie Kirk, who said that school shootings are simply the cost of the Second Amendment. Think about what that means for a second. He is acknowledging the horror of children being gunned down in their classrooms, but dismissing it as collateral damage for a political ideology. In this framing, those children don't need to be mourned for who they are, for their families that will never see them again. They are transformed into data points in an ideological battle, sacrifices for freedom, as if their stolen futures can be neatly justified away. And he's not alone in this. Many like him think the same way, because to mourn these children fully would mean confronting the cost of their own political position. If you admit that their deaths are a moral catastrophe that could have been prevented in some way, then suddenly the cost of the Second Amendment is not some abstract trade-off. It's blood on your hands. It's a reminder that the principles you defend may have victims. So instead of acknowledging this fact, these victims are dehumanized. Their stories are drowned out by the arguments of rights, freedoms, and what counts as American. But this reveals the same dissonance we see everywhere. When a victim does not fit into the neatly packaged narrative, they aren't mourned. They aren't allowed to be innocent lives taken too soon. Instead, their existence becomes inconvenient. So rather than empathizing, many people retreat into these talking points. It's mental health. It's the price of liberty. But what none of these defenses do is sit with the unbearable truth that children are being killed where they're supposed to be the safest. And when you look at it from this angle, doesn't it feel eerily similar to the suffering treated on a global scale? Certain tragedies get candlelight visuals, hashtags, and outpouring of international empathy, while others get silence, or worse, justification. A drone strike that kills a family in Yemen is waved as the cost of fighting terrorism. Colonial famines are written off as the cost of modernization. In America, in other parts of the West, school shootings are shrugged off as the cost of the Second Amendment. The logic is disturbingly the same. Lives can be mourned only if They serve a story that you already believe in. Otherwise, their deaths are excused, rationalized, or ignored. But what does that say about us? That we'd rather protect our narratives than protect human beings? That the dignity of life is negotiable, pending on whether they fit our politics? The danger here is that we lose the ability to see beyond these scripts. To say, no, a child being killed in a school is not the cost of liberty. It's a tragedy, period. And just like drone strikes killing families is not the cost of security, a famine wiping out millions is not the cost of progress. It's wrong. It's heartbreaking. And we should be able to mourn without qualifiers, without needing to fit it into the story we've already told ourselves. But if we can't, then what we're saying is that we don't care about the victims. We care about useful victims. The ones that prop up our worldview, the ones that make us feel morally superior. And once again, the actual victims, the children, the families, the lives, are lost in the noise of our ideological battles. And here's the danger. Once we make this empathy conditional, we lose our ability to respond to suffering as human beings first. We stop seeing people as people and start seeing them as arguments. The victims themselves, whether in Gaza, Sudan, or on the streets of America, they get lost. Their humanity disappears under the weight of our narratives. This is why this matters. Because when empathy becomes conditional, it's no longer about justice or dignity or truth. It becomes about winning. It becomes about protecting your side, your narrative, your ideology. And in that process, victims stop being mourned and start being used. Let's zoom out to the global stage, because the truth is, the same logic that dismisses the deaths of children in schools as the cost of the Second Amendment also shapes how we view international tragedies. The question of who gets to be mourned and who doesn't cuts across these borders, histories, and centuries. We looked at 9/11, for example, and how it was one of the darkest days of American history, and how thousands of lives were lost in a single morning, and the world paused. They paused to grieve with America. Vigils were held across the globe, and the victims were remembered not just as Americans, but as human beings. Their faces were shown, their stories were told, and their families were given the platform to grieve with dignity. And in many ways, it was one of the best examples of mourning done right. But when we look at what happened years after, the war on terror launched drone attacks, invasions that killed tens of thousands of civilians in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Pakistan. Children were buried, families were destroyed in the middle of the night, and yet, where are those vigils? Where are the candlelight memorials for those victims? Instead, their deaths are framed as some kind of collateral damage. Their humanity is erased in the name of security. Their grief is silenced under the justification of preventing the next 9/11. And it's not that the victims of 9/11 don't deserve the mourning they received. They absolutely did. It's that the victims of these drone strikes deserved it too. But because they didn't fit the political narrative or racial profile of an innocent victim, because they were brown, Muslim, foreign, and once again, mourning became conditional. History is filled with the same hierarchy of grief. Like I said, the Holocaust was universally acknowledged as one of the greatest crimes ever done to a group of people. The industrial scale murder of Jews is seared into the global memory as a moral line that should never be crossed again. And yet, famines engineered through deliberate British policies in India or in Ireland, those millions of deaths don't occupy the same sacred place in our collective memory, or unavoidable consequences of empire. They are minimized and explained away as natural disasters, even though we know that they were preventable and intentional in some of these cases. So why the difference? Why do some atrocities become universally recognized while others are relegated to the margins of history? Part of it is about narrative. The Holocaust fits neatly into the story of evil versus good, tyranny versus freedom. Colonial famines, they complicate things because they indict the very empires that shape the world order. In other words, mourning becomes political capital. Who we remember and who we forget tells us more about power than about compassion. Mahmoud Mamdani, in his book Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, about how the West divides victims and communities into categories that serve its narrative. Good Muslims are mournable, relatable, the ones who fit into the story of innocence, while bad victims are those whose deaths can be justified because they live in the wrong place or are assumed to be complicit, or simply because their survival threatens the dominant political order. The line between who is mourned and who is erased is not drawn by morality. And I'll be honest here, this is not abstract for me. As a Muslim woman, I see this double standard play out constantly in real time. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the world lit up and spoke out against it. People raised money, they opened their homes, they changed their social media bios overnight, and they were right to do that because Ukrainians do deserve that solidarity. But at the same time, when Gaza was bombed, when entire Palestinian families were pulled from the rubble, the same energy isn't there. Suddenly, the mourning becomes political, and people hesitate, or worse, they justify it. And even some really, really messed up people cheer for it. And I feel that, and I feel it deeply. Because what that communicates is not just that some lives matter more, but that my life, my community's life, doesn't matter at all. And if that were me under the rubble, if it were my family erased by a drone strike, the world wouldn't care. They would call it collateral, they'd scroll past, and they'd explain it in any way that they can, just so that they don't have to face it. And that's what selective mourning does. It doesn't just erase the victims in that moment. It sends a message to the living. It tells us that we don't fit the profile of the perfect victim, that our humanity is negotiable and our grief is too complicated to acknowledge. And honestly, that's devastating, because if mourning is supposed to affirm the dignity of human life, what does that mean when dignity is extended to some and not all? Because real mourning is uncomfortable. It forces us to see the humanity in people that we've been taught to fear, devalue, or ignore. It asks us to sit with the unbearable truth that a Palestinian child under the rubble is no different from a child killed in a school shooting, or a commuter on a New York City subway, or a Jewish family in 1940s Europe. Their lives matter equally, and their deaths are equally tragic. There's another layer to this whole phenomenon that I think we need to confront, and that's not just that some victims are mourned while others are ignored. It's that often the victims themselves are stripped of their individuality altogether. They stop being people with names, dreams, and flaws. They become symbols. They are weapons used in political battles, used to score points, to justify politics, to rally outrage, to affirm someone's worldview. And once that happens, they're consumed. And we've seen this over and over again. The victims of 9/11's memory was used to justify wars that had nothing to do with the actual attacks. Their deaths became the moral shield for the politics that killed far more innocent people abroad. The humanity of these victims was replaced by their utility. They weren't remembered as unique lives cut short, but remembered as a justification for empire. The same thing happens with school shootings. Each time children are killed, politicians line up with their scripts ready. On one side, their faces are plastered on posters demanding gun control. On the other, they're dismissed as tragic but unavoidable, in defense of the Second Amendment. Either way, the individuality of these children, their names are replaced by statistics, their grief is turned into ammunition, and their deaths are debated rather than mourned. This plays out globally as well. Take Gaza, for example. Every single time a Palestinian child is killed, you can watch in real time how their deaths are folded into these perfect narratives. This, to me, feels like one of the cruelest aspects of the aesthetic of victimhood, because in that process, the actual victims, they get lost. They don't get the dignity of being remembered for who they actually were. They are flattened into caricatures, and their humanity is swallowed by the fight over what their death means. Fanon, writing about colonialism, warned about this. He said colonial violence doesn't just kill the people physically, It kills their humanity in the eyes of the world. Victims of empire aren't seen as individuals with souls. They're seen as examples, cases, casualties. And that's what happens when these victims become symbols. Their deaths aren't theirs anymore. And Edward Said talks about something similar in Orientalism, when he emphasizes how the West constructs images of the East that fit its needs. Victims of war, famine, and occupation are turned into these tropes. Their complexity, their personhood is erased so that their suffering can serve a purpose for a story, an image to portray this kind of meaning. And I think that's the dissonance I keep coming back to, because even someone like Charlie Kirk, who I disagree with fundamentally, who I think has spread some of the most harmful rhetoric, when he was killed, I still believe that his death shouldn't be cheered. He was a human being who was murdered. But that's the uncomfortable part, isn't it? That this is the same man who once justified the killings of Palestinians and Muslims, people who look like me and a quarter of the world's population. He saw videos of families being bombarded, children being buried under the rubble, and instead of condemning it, he excused it. He decided that these lives don't fit his perfect narrative of the innocent victims. In his framing, they weren't grievable. And now, after his own death, I've seen people do the same thing. But if we do that, we're walking into the same cycle, the same logic that dehumanizes a lot of other people in the world. And it becomes this kind of trap. So what I suggest we do is not what he did. If we're serious about breaking this cycle, we have to refuse it, even when it's the hardest, even when it involves someone like Charlie Kirk. Because otherwise, we're not really standing for human dignity. We're just flipping a script. Think about what happens if we continue justifying deaths that don't serve our narrative. Every drone strike that gets excused, every school shooting becomes the cost of freedom, and every famine victim is dismissed as an accident of history. And the cycle of dehumanization continues. This violence becomes normal, and indifference becomes so easy, and the world just becomes a darker and colder place. But what if we broke this cycle? What if we refused to sort victims into worthy and unworthy, or ours and theirs, and if we could simply say the death of a child is a death of a child, no matter whose flag they are born under. A massacre is a massacre, whether it happens in a classroom, a synagogue, or a refugee camp. That shift doesn't mean abandoning politics. It doesn't mean being naive about power or ignoring who causes harm, but it does mean insisting that human dignity comes first. That grief cannot be monopolized by nations or movements or ideologies. That our mourning should always be expansive and never selective. Because if we can do it, if we can mourn universally, we might start seeing each other again, and not just as pawns in an endless ideological war, but as human beings. And maybe then the aesthetic of victimhood would lose its power, because we would have remembered what it means to be human. If we can do this, then grief itself becomes a form of defiance, a refusal to let politics strip people of their humanity. So maybe the real challenge isn't to fight for justice or to expose hypocrisy. Maybe the real challenge is to remember how to grieve without conditions, to reclaim mourning as something that unites rather than divides, because only then can we begin to break that cycle. If every life has equal worth, then every death deserves equal grief. And until we live like that, we haven't really remembered what it means to be human.